They woke up expecting to die. The sky was still dark. The air was cold. In the silence before dawn, a group of Japanese women, some barely out of nursing school, others hardened by months on the retreating front, were marched from their tent barracks by American soldiers in wide-brimmed hats. Their hands trembled, their eyes fixed on the horizon where they expected rifles to be raised at sunrise. One woman whispered a prayer to no one. Another clutched a lock of her child's hair sewn into her sleeve. But when they reached the clearing, something strange hung in the air. Not fear, not anger, but smoke. Greasy, fragrant smoke. It drifted from a cast-iron skillet resting on a metal grate. One of the Americans, boots muddy, hat tilted back, was flipping bacon. Another poured coffee into battered tin cups. No rifles, no blindfolds, only breakfast. It was the wrong smell, the wrong silence, the wrong ending. And it was only the beginning, and it was colder than they expected. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in threadbare military coats that did little against the damp chill of early morning. Their breath came out in faint clouds, barely visible in the fading darkness. Each step they had taken from the barracks had felt heavier than the last, as if their own bodies were trying to resist the pull of inevitability. Their boots, cracked and uneven, scraped against gravel. Some shuffled, some walked stiffly upright, as if willing their posture to be their last act of defiance. No one spoke. There were no screams, no pleas for mercy, only silence, broken by the soft clinking of metal gear from the guards flanking them. In their heads, each woman prepared in her own way for the end. A few recited mantras from training, others whispered memories of home, of children's faces or old lullabies. Starvation had hollowed them, but it was the uncertainty that made them tremble. For months they had survived on clumps of rice, with moldy, pickled vegetables stretching across days. Their bones ached from sleep stolen in tents and trenches, their nerves frayed by the distant echo of artillery and the closer, sharper crack of commands. The Americans had said nothing, not since waking them under the cover of darkness, not as they were ordered to form lines and follow the guards beyond the wire. That silence was itself a sentence. Some remembered the whispers from other camps, executions disguised as relocation, where the firing squad stood just beyond the tree line. One woman, who had once served as a nurse at a field hospital, walked as if already halfway dead. Her eyes were dry but vacant, her thoughts too tired for resistance. Another, barely 20, bit the inside of her cheek until it bled. Better pain than panic. Better anything than the slow, growing certainty that this was how it ended, quietly, without fanfare, without family. They emerged from the tree line into a clearing lit with the first threads of dawn, and that's when it hit them. Not the bark of rifles, not the cold press of steel, but smoke. Greasy, warm, utterly foreign, it curled in the air like something alive. For a moment, they thought it might be a funeral pyre. But no, there was movement. One American crouched beside a fire, his hat tipped back, poking at something in a skillet. Another sipped from a tin cup, nodding lazily to a third who was cracking eggs into a pan. Bacon sizzled, its fat snapping in the firelight. Somewhere in the background, a radio played a faint, twangy tune, guitars and drawls utterly out of place. The guards surrounding the women didn't raise their rifles, they didn't shout. One of them gestured toward the fire and said something none of the women understood, but the tone wasn't sharp. It was casual, almost inviting. The women froze. No one moved. It was a trap. It had to be. This performance, this grotesque joke, cook breakfast before the execution? Lull them with food before the real cruelty began? One woman took a half-step back, her fists clenched. Another, too hungry to pretend otherwise, stared openly at the skillet. The smell was unbearable. Rich, meaty, salty, an aroma many hadn't known in years. It wasn't just hunger that gripped them, it was memory. Kitchens before the war, childhood, fathers home from work. Bacon had no place here, not with barbed wire behind them and rifles so close. Then one of the Americans stood, looked directly at the group, and walked toward them slowly. He held out a mug, metal, dented, steaming. Coffee. Its scent curled into the clearing like an invitation. The nearest woman flinched, but when he didn't step closer, didn't force it into her hand, she reached out with trembling fingers. The mug was warm, heavier than she expected. She stared at it as if it might vanish. When she raised it to her lips, the bitterness hit her tongue like a jolt of electricity. Her eyes filled instantly, not from the taste, but from the fact that it was real. This wasn't execution. This wasn't punishment. It was something worse, something far more dangerous. It was kindness. And kindness, they had been taught, was not part of war. It was not to be trusted, not from the enemy, and certainly not from Americans. As the coffee cooled in her hand and the smell of bacon continued to thicken in the air, the nurse, once assigned to tend to the wounded in Okinawa, could only stare. Her mind searched for the script, the proper response, but none came. She had memorized lines about courage, death, sacrifice. Not this. Not how to sit on a stump in the cold and sip coffee offered by a man who should have shot her. The dissonance twisted inside her like a second stomach. Around her, other women had begun to take the food. A slab of fried egg, a strip of bacon, bread with soft butter. It was surreal, almost theatrical. It felt like a betrayal, not of country, but of expectation. They had been raised beneath the shadow of a single truth. Surrender was worse than death. Bushido, the warrior code that once ruled samurai, had been passed down like scripture. Their officers had spoken of it not as theory, but as law. Death before dishonor, they had repeated like a hymn. In training camps, young women were instructed on how to stab themselves in the neck with sewing needles if capture seemed inevitable. A swift strike, they were told. One motion and no enemy would claim your body. Some carried cyanide tablets sewn into the hems of their tunics. To die was not defeat, it was purity. They had watched films that depicted American soldiers as rabid beasts, bayoneting civilians, laughing as they looted temples. Textbooks warned them that Americans desecrated bodies, that surrender meant shame for your entire bloodline. Some believed it so deeply that they rehearsed their final moments in private, whispering prayers over their own imagined corpses. Even in the final days, as the Empire's territory collapsed island by island, the warnings had not stopped. In the bunkers, as bombs fell and supply lines snapped, officers whispered what command dared not put to paper. If captured, the women would be tortured, violated, then killed. They would be made to beg before the end. One woman remembered a sergeant's exact words, "Better to run into gunfire than into their arms." That was the image they had carried through the war. Enemy hands that stripped, mocked, destroyed. So when the guards knocked on their tent that morning and ordered them out, that was the fate they expected. But it hadn't come. Not yet. Instead, it was eggs with yolks still runny, bacon still crisp with fat, biscuits so soft they crumbled at a breath. A kind of dream meal, too absurd to trust. Even as their hands moved toward the food, their minds screamed that it was poisoned. A few women recoiled. One dropped her tin plate and let it shatter across the stones. But no punishment came, no rifles raised, no laughter from the Americans, just a quiet nod from one of the soldiers as if to say, "You don't have to eat it, but it's there." The nurse finally tasted a bite. The yolk coated her tongue like silk. She chewed slowly, as if her body might reject it. Her jaw trembled, not from hunger, but from confusion. If this wasn't a trick, if this was real, then the world she knew had ruptured. The lie had begun to crack. This was not what surrender was supposed to feel like. It was not a strip of bacon that undid her. It was the ease with which the man who had handed it to her returned to the fire and stirred the pot again, as if it meant nothing, as if she were not his enemy, as if she were simply a person who needed to eat. And that, more than anything, terrified her. That feeling didn't fade when they were marched behind the gates. If anything, it deepened. The fences were high and lined with barbed wire, just as expected. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, and soldiers with rifles patrolled the perimeter. But no one yelled, no one shoved. At the entrance, they were stopped, counted again, and handed tags with numbers. A few women braced for orders to strip. They tightened their hands around the folds of their uniforms, ready to be humiliated. But the commands never came. Instead, they were pointed toward wooden barracks, low buildings with clean roofs and orderly walkways. Even the dirt seemed swept. Inside, the women hesitated at the threshold. They had slept in foxholes, in hospital ruins, on mats in the jungle. This looked deliberate. Bunk beds lined both sides of the room. Each had a folded blanket at the foot and a pillow, the fabric white as snow. A bucket of water stood in the corner, along with a stack of towels. The youngest woman in the group, barely 19, whispered, "Are we really meant to sleep here?" Her voice cracked on the last word. No one answered. They didn't trust the moment. And still it kept happening. The surreal generosity. A basket of toiletries appeared, combs, small bars of soap, toothbrushes still in their wrappers. One woman picked up a soap bar and sniffed it. She blinked, stunned. It smelled faintly of lavender. That scent, too soft, too floral, felt more disarming than a loaded rifle. Another tried on a pair of brown canvas shoes from a bin near the door. They fit perfectly. She took them off again and put them back, suspicious. The food came next. Trays carried in with bowls of rice and beans, chunks of pork, sliced oranges. A guard said something in English, gestured to eat, then left them alone. They sat on benches, staring at the trays as if they might explode. Slowly, reluctantly, one woman picked up her spoon. She took a bite, then another. Her shoulders sagged. Her body, starved of calories for weeks, began to surrender faster than her mind. Others followed. There were no punishments, no speeches, no sneering guards circling them like predators. Just food and quiet and time. But trust came slowly, if it came at all. On the second night, one of the older women tried to sleep with her boots on. Another tucked biscuits into the hem of her uniform, convinced this feast would vanish at any moment. A nurse who had assisted amputations during the final siege refused to speak at all, staring blankly at her bunk, waiting for the real cruelty to begin. It couldn't be this easy. There had to be something waiting, interrogations, humiliation, forced confessions, and yet none came. The guards didn't leer. They didn't laugh. They mostly ignored the women, standing at posts with an air of detached routine. That detachment was almost more disturbing. It made the women feel invisible and seen all at once, as if their suffering, their training, the weight of surrender, didn't matter at all here, as if they were not symbols of a fallen empire, but just tired strangers in need of rest. One woman refused to lie under the blanket her first night. She sat upright for hours, arms crossed tightly, determined to feel cold. She was not ready to be warm. Warmth felt like a trick, and still her body betrayed her. By morning, she had pulled the blanket over her shoulders in her sleep. When she woke, she cried, not because she was afraid, but because it felt good, and nothing had ever felt more dangerous. Then came the paper. A guard stepped into the barrack one afternoon and placed a stack of supplies on the center table: writing pads, stubby pencils, a box of envelopes. The message was simple. They were allowed to write home. 1 letter per week, no more than 2 pages. It would be reviewed, but it would be delivered. The women sat in stunned silence, staring at the pile as if it had grown teeth. One finally stepped forward, slowly, as though approaching a corpse. She picked up a pencil, tested it in her hand, then set it back down. No one moved for several minutes. For years, they had been told this moment would never come. Prisoners, if they survived capture at all, would vanish into nameless suffering. There would be no messages, no mercy, no return. Now, to be handed a chance to write to their families, not under duress, not with a knife pressed to the page, felt like a breach in everything they had believed. Writing meant survival. It meant exposure. It meant declaring, in ink, that surrender had not led to death. And for many, that felt like treason. The cultural weight of dishonor was more than tradition, it was law. A captured soldier brought shame to their entire bloodline. A daughter who surrendered instead of taking her own life brought disgrace to her ancestors. What did one even say in a letter home? That the enemy fed them stew thick with meat? That they had slept through the night without once being woken by boots or blows? That they had been given soap that smelled like flowers? These truths weren't just hard to confess. They felt impossible. Still, eventually, the first pencil scratched across the paper. The woman's name was Noriko, a nurse who had treated frostbitten soldiers in Manchuria. Her handwriting was slow, uneven, as if the words fought her. "Mother, I am alive. I was not beaten. They gave me stew, and it was hot. There is bread here, and it is soft. I do not understand this war any more." She stared at the final sentence for a long time before folding the page and slipping it into the envelope. She did not seal it. She could not yet own those words. Others followed, hesitantly. Some wrote short, factual letters. "I am in a camp. I sleep in a bed. There is food." Others poured emotion into theirs, quietly crying as they remembered siblings, fathers, school friends left behind in cities now reduced to ash. But every sentence written carried the same haunting subtext. I am not suffering the way I was told I would. It was not a confession of betrayal, but of confusion. And that confusion, spreading across hundreds of letters, became a kind of silent revolution. Of course, the letters did not go unnoticed. Before they reached the hands of families, they were intercepted by Japanese intelligence. Senses, trained to detect hidden messages and morale threats, read through each one. At first, they dismissed the contents as propaganda. Surely the Americans had forced the women to write such things. But the repetition unsettled them, the emotional consistency, the small details. A woman wrote of being given new shoes. Another described being taught how to plant tomatoes. One mentioned laughter over a bowl of rice porridge. These were not the messages of terrorized prisoners. They were something far more dangerous, honest contradictions. Some letters never made it to their destinations. Others were edited, delayed, or simply destroyed. But a few slipped through, and when they reached the streets of Tokyo, of Osaka, of Nagasaki, they hit like whispered bombs. Neighbors gathered to read them aloud in secret. Families clutched them with shaking hands. And across the war-torn nation, one question began to take root. What if everything we were told about the enemy was wrong? And for the women behind the fences, staring at their empty hands after the letters were taken away, that question lingered long after the ink had dried. But it was in the mess hall, not the barracks, where the real war began to unravel, not with weapons or orders, but with stew, with salt, with smoke. Breakfast came early and without ceremony. The women lined up in silence, hands loosely at their sides, their eyes wary as they entered the wooden hall. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows. The air inside was thick with the scent of frying pork and boiled beans, of bread toasted over flame and butter beginning to melt. It smelled like nothing they had known for years. It smelled like danger. A young woman stepped forward and received her tray. Bacon curled at the edges, soft bread with a crust that flaked like pastry, a mug of coffee so black it shimmered. She sat without a word. The others followed, mechanical in their movements, trying not to betray the turmoil inside. Across from her, a nurse lifted a spoon to her lips and froze mid-motion. She stared at the broth, thick with carrots and small slivers of meat. Then, slowly, she tasted it. The reaction was immediate. Her shoulders sagged, her throat clenched. She blinked fast, too proud to cry, but too overwhelmed to stop the sting in her eyes. Each bite was a betrayal, not of their country, but of the armor they had built around their suffering. Food was supposed to be rationed, cold, and scarce, an extension of war. This was warmth. It was abundance. And it asked a question they were not ready to answer. What if this was not the enemy they had prepared for? The psychological cost of kindness crept in quietly. No one spoke of it, but each woman felt it. A full belly came with shame. The act of chewing without fear of it being snatched away felt like weakness. Accepting help, especially from them, was not just hard. It was humiliating. Some refused to eat the meat, touching only the bread. Others took the coffee but drank it with their heads lowered, as if swallowing guilt. One woman sat with her tray untouched until a guard passed and said something in a soft, flat tone. She flinched, but when she looked up, he simply pointed to the food and shrugged, as if to say, "It's not a trap, it's breakfast." Still, nothing felt safe. Even flavor itself betrayed them. The first taste of real butter startled a woman so badly she spat it out, shaking her head like she'd been burned. Another bit into an orange and gasped when the juice ran down her chin. She hadn't tasted citrus in years. She laughed nervously, then clapped her hand over her mouth, terrified by the sound of her own joy. Because that was the real weapon here. Not bullets, not barbed wire, but memory. With each bite, something stirred. Childhood, pre-war summers, mothers packing lunchboxes, brothers teasing over morning rice. All those things they had shut away, hidden under layers of steel and duty and silence, came flooding back, carried not by speeches, but by flavor. And yet the meals kept coming. Morning, noon, night. Eggs scrambled with herbs, soup thick with barley, coffee always hot, always ready. Their bodies changed first. Cheeks filled out, fingers steadied, hair lost its brittle sheen. But something deeper was shifting too. The rhythm of camp life, grounded in salt and smoke, began to chip away at what they thought captivity would be. One morning, a girl took her tray, sat down, and before she even realized it, smiled. Just for a moment. And it terrified her, because in that smile was something she hadn't felt in years. She felt safe, and safety, she had learned, was the first step toward forgetting how to hate. The next step came in the form of a paper envelope. One morning, while the sun was still crawling over the hills behind the camp, a woman sat on the stoop of the barracks, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. A guard passed, not hurried, not hostile, and without a word held something out to her. It was a small packet, creased and smudged, with a drawing of green stalks on the front. She didn't take it at first. She only looked at him. He didn't insist. He just pointed past the fence, toward a square of earth near the back wall of the camp. Then he walked on, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. She opened the packet. Seeds. Real ones. Lettuce, maybe? Or beans. The sort she remembered pressing into the soil with her grandmother on the island of Kyushu long before the war. Her fingers trembled as she touched them. It wasn't an order. It wasn't labor. It was something else entirely. It started slowly. That afternoon, she knelt in the dry soil, dragging her hands through the earth with uncertain strokes. No one stopped her. No one watched. The other women saw her from the distance, curious but wary. Within days, others joined. Not all in the garden. Some swept the walkways, not because they were told to, but because the dust had started to annoy them. A pair of women began helping in the kitchen, learning to measure flour, to knead dough. One of the nurses asked for scissors and began trimming torn blankets, patching holes, stitching repairs with meticulous care. No one made them. They simply did it. And with that, something fragile and defiant began to take root. Choice. They started baking, not just bread, but rolls with cinnamon, crusty loaves that cracked when torn. It was messy, imperfect work, hands still unused to softness, but it was theirs. They cleaned the barracks not to please the guards, but to make the place feel less like prison and more like something else. In the evenings, they gathered around the fire pit behind the laundry room. Someone sang an old schoolyard song, tentative at first, then louder when no punishment followed. One night they told jokes, not about war, not about loss, but about chickens and hungry ghosts and girls with crooked teeth. They laughed, real laughter, not the tight, desperate kind. That fire became their hearth. Around it they spoke more openly, of life before uniforms, of childhoods along rivers. One woman revealed she had once danced in kabuki, not as a performer, but as a stagehand. Another had been a schoolteacher, fond of telling ghost stories to her students. These stories didn't change their circumstances, but they chipped away at the silence. They gave shape to something the war had tried to erase: identity. And in the garden, the seeds began to rise, just a sprout here, a green thread there. Still, it was enough. Every morning someone went to water the patch with a tin cup. They shielded the young leaves from wind. They checked for beetles. It became a ritual, quiet, gentle, sacred. In a place meant to strip them of agency, they were growing something. It was not just food. It was proof. Proof that even in captivity, they still had hands that could build, minds that could tend, spirits that could reclaim the smallest corners of freedom, inch by inch, root by root. And the miracle was not that the garden bloomed. It was that, for the first time in years, they believed it might. The sound came one evening just as the sky began to bruise purple behind the guard towers. It was faint at first, barely more than breath threaded through metal. A harmonica. One of the guards sat on an overturned crate near the supply shed, his hat tipped low, his boots crossed at the ankle. He played without announcement, without audience, as if the music were meant only for himself. The notes drifted across the yard, uncertain and a little crooked, but unmistakably alive. The women froze where they stood. Some were carrying laundry, others were returning from the garden with dirt still clinging to their hands. No one spoke. No one moved closer. They listened as if afraid the sound might shatter if acknowledged. Music had been dangerous once. In imperial Japan, beauty was indulgence, and indulgence was weakness. Songs existed for ceremonies, for marching, for mourning the dead. Beauty for its own sake was suspect, a distraction from duty. Many of the women had gone years without hearing a melody not tethered to command. Radios had gone silent long before the surrender. Instruments had been sold, burned, or abandoned. Silence had become normal. Silence had become survival. So when the harmonica sang, it struck something deep and fragile. A woman who had not cried since her capture felt tears gather without warning. She pressed her sleeve to her mouth, ashamed of the sound that escaped her. Another closed her eyes and saw, vividly, her father repairing nets by the sea, humming as he worked. A third remembered a school festival, lanterns glowing, children laughing. These memories rose uninvited, unlocked by a tune with no words and no orders attached. The guard finished the song, nodded once to no one in particular, and packed the harmonica away. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, but the door had been opened. The next night the music returned, this time from the recreation hut. Someone had found an old piano there, its keys chipped, its strings slightly out of tune. One of the women approached it hesitantly, running her fingers over the wood as if touching something sacred. She had learned to play as a child, before uniforms and ration cards. Her hands hovered, uncertain. Then she pressed a key. The sound was imperfect, but it was sound. She pressed another. Slowly, a melody emerged, simple, halting, unmistakably human. Others gathered. They did not clap. They did not speak. They listened. Some sat on the floor. Others leaned against the walls. A woman near the door began to hum, softly at first, then with more confidence. The tune filled the room, weaving between the piano's rough notes. When the song ended, no one moved. It was not applause they wanted. It was permission. And permission, quietly, had already been granted. From then on, music slipped into the camp like contraband joy. A radio appeared, tuned carefully in the evenings. American songs, unfamiliar and bright, mingled with the women's own melodies. Someone sketched the piano in charcoal on scrap paper. Another wrote lyrics she had not dared to remember. At night, lying on their bunks, the women hummed to themselves, the sound low and private, like prayer. They began to sleep more deeply. Dreams returned, some painful, some sweet, all of them alive. Beauty, once forbidden, reclaimed its place. It did not weaken them, it steadied them. In the glow of a bare bulb, a woman braided another's hair while singing an old folk song. Laughter followed when they forgot a verse and made one up instead. The guards did not intervene. They passed by, listening, some pausing briefly before continuing on their rounds. The wire still stood, the towers still loomed. But inside the camp, something irreversible had happened. They were no longer only surviving. They were remembering who they had been before the world taught them to be silent. But that remembrance brought with it an unbearable weight. Each sunrise in the camp now came with coffee, bread, and something harder to swallow. Questions. Questions that twisted deep beneath the surface in the quiet spaces where old certainties had lived. They weren't spoken aloud, no one dared, but they hung in the air between meals and chores and songs. If the Americans are not monsters, then who lied to us? And why did we fight? The camp had not changed much on the outside. The fences were still there. The towers still watched. The uniforms still separated the guarded from the guard. But inside, something irreversible was unfolding. Acts of kindness, once feared, then tolerated, now chipped at the core of belief. A guard handing a woman a cup of stew with a smile didn't just feed her. He destabilized the entire narrative she'd been raised on. Every gesture, every bit of decency left behind a crack in the wall of indoctrination. This was not a physical battle. This was the collapse of certainty. For many, survival had always been a shameful word. In imperial doctrine, to survive capture was a stain. You were meant to die with honor, not live with disgrace. And now, to be offered life and dignity with such care shattered the logic they had clung to. A folded blanket, a door that didn't lock from the outside, a toothbrush replaced without request. These things should have felt like nothing. But they felt like betrayal, not of country, but of belief. Women woke each morning and didn't brace for a slap. They weren't stripped of their names, their hair, their right to speak. Slowly, those reflexes dulled. The silence they had worn like armor began to crack, not with rebellion, but with something gentler and more dangerous, comfort. That comfort was not without consequence. It made them remember who they had been before the war. It made them wonder if they could be that again, and worst of all, it made them question whether everything they had been told about the enemy, about mercy, about dignity, about evil, had been nothing more than a weapon. The real cruelty, they now realized, wasn't starvation. It was having your ability to trust stolen from you. It was being taught to fear kindness more than you feared death. And in that reversal, belief began to fracture. The quiet of the camp no longer felt like suppression. It felt like space to think. Some women began to speak more openly, in whispers at first. "Do you remember the stories?" one asked another. "The ones they told us in the briefings? About the Americans feeding their prisoners to pigs?" The other woman nodded slowly. "I believed them," she said. "I really did." They both laughed, but it was the bitter, hollow kind. At night they lay awake, not because of fear, but because their minds would not stop spinning. The scent of clean laundry, the sound of someone humming 2 bunks over, the way a soldier nodded politely when passing, all of it, combined into a daily erosion of the version of the world they had once held as gospel. And in that erosion, something radical bloomed: doubt. Because doubt, once planted, cannot be silenced. It grows wild in the quiet, and it forces questions that no punishment can unask. Who had used them? What had they fought for? What had been real? And if Mercy could feel this honest, what else had been a lie? If you're enjoying this story so far, like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The envelope arrived with a stack of others, indistinguishable at first glance, sealed, censored, stamped with the red ink of Allied processing. A young intelligence officer in a crisp uniform carried it into a dimly lit office in Tokyo and handed it to his superior. The man behind the desk didn't look up at first. He had read dozens of these by now. Strange, unsettling reports from women they had believed long dead. But this one made him pause. He slid it open with the edge of a ruler, unfolded the thin page, and read the first few lines aloud to the others in the room. "They gave me glasses so I can see again. I cried. Not from pain, but because I forgot the sky looked like this." A silence fell, heavier than the smoke hanging in the air. One man shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down at the floor. Outside, in the heart of a city stripped raw by bombs and hunger, the machinery of war stuttered on. But in that moment, in that quiet room, a general, a man who had signed off on hundreds of unreturnable names, set the letter down with shaking fingers. Because this wasn't propaganda, it wasn't coded, it wasn't the voice of an enemy playing psychological games. It was raw, uneven, human, and that made it infinitely more dangerous. What terrified Japanese intelligence wasn't the content itself, it was the simplicity. A girl writing home about glasses, about sight, about seeing the world clearly for the first time since she was 10 years old. No screams, no cruelty, no mention of brutality. Just a single act of care, and with that one detail, the lie began to crumble. Empathy, they realized, was the most insidious weapon of all. The home front was brittle, held together by ration books, recycled slogans, and the kind of blind belief that only thrives in silence. Letters like this cracked that silence wide open. If women in American prison camps were being treated not just fairly, but kindly, what did that say about everything the Empire had told its people? The war had demanded dehumanization of both the enemy and the self. Now, the enemy was giving back vision, warmth, safety, and the prisoners were writing about it. More letters followed. One described being taught how to cook with butter. Another joked about a guard who tried to pronounce Japanese and failed so spectacularly it made the women laugh for hours. These weren't military communiques. They were soft bombs, detonating not with explosions, but with contradictions. The more authentic they sounded, the harder they were to discredit. And that made them more threatening than sabotage. High command began to whisper about containment, not of soldiers, but of sentiment. How many more letters were out there? How many had already slipped through? And how long before someone, somewhere, started asking dangerous questions? Because this wasn't just a war of nations anymore. It was a war of ideas. And the Americans, it seemed, had figured out something devastating. That kindness could outmaneuver cruelty, that a bar of soap, a warm bed, or a pair of eyeglasses could do what bullets never could, make someone stop hating you. In the barracks, the woman who had written the letter sat quietly by the window, unaware of the storm her words had caused. Her glasses, thick and slightly crooked, perched on her nose as she mended a shirt under the light. She wasn't thinking of generals or strategy. She was thinking about the sky. She hadn't seen its color in years. Now she could. And somewhere across the sea, a man who had never met her sat sweating in his chair, holding a letter that weighed more than any weapon he had ever ordered fired. The fence opened not with ceremony, but with silence. No band, no salute, no declaration. Just the slow creak of a gate that had always stayed shut. Until now. The war was over. Papers had been signed. The prisoners, no longer prisoners, were going home. But what did home mean to a woman who had not seen it since her world had been flipped, starved, then strangely healed on foreign soil? They stepped through that gate like sleepwalkers, each carrying only what they could hold. A blanket, a comb, a tin of powdered milk one of the American guards had pressed into their hands before they left. No orders, just a quiet, "Good luck." Some smiled, others looked away. None of the women said what they were really feeling, that walking out of the fence was harder than walking in had been. When they arrived in Japan, it was as if time had skipped. Cities were dust and bones. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened into silence. They stepped onto train platforms with no roofs, walked through stations with shattered windows. The air smelled of ash. Shops were shuttered or stripped bare. People did not recognize them, and when they did, they didn't always welcome them. A woman who had survived capture brought shame with her. She was supposed to have died. Her return was a complication, a reminder, a ghost. They stood in rice lines with bowls clutched to their chest, just like everyone else. They didn't speak of the camp, not out loud, not to strangers, but in the quiet corners, behind paper doors, beneath shared blankets at night, they remembered. Not the hunger, not the fear, but the fire, the bacon, the smell of coffee, foreign and rich, curling up into the morning light, and the men who had been called monsters smiling beneath cowboy hats, asking if they wanted seconds. That memory clung tighter than anything else. They had expected their last morning to be blood and gravel and blindfolds. Instead, it had been eggs, a harmonica, a man named Jack who told a joke about his horse. It didn't make sense. It still didn't make sense. But the warmth of that moment, its absurd, shattering kindness, had buried itself somewhere deep. It surfaced in the smell of boiled barley, in the sound of a bell, in the sight of a child holding out a rice cracker with both hands. Some of the women wrote about it, years later when it was safer, in private journals, in letters never sent. A few testified in post-war interviews, their voices steady but their eyes distant. "They gave me soap," one said. "They didn't have to, but they did." Another recalled how one guard used to sing while sweeping. "I hated him at first," she admitted. "Then I started humming along." No medals were given for what happened in that camp. No plaques were hung. No ceremonies were held. But something had shifted. The kindness had not undone the war, but it had undone the certainty that the world was simple. That enemy meant evil. That mercy was weakness. And, once that belief cracked, something else could take root. Something like healing. A handful of the women kept in touch with each other over the years, quiet reunions, folded photos passed between wrinkled fingers. None of them forgot. Not the fence, not the fear, and not the breakfast. Because on the morning they thought they would die, they were instead fed. And no act of violence had ever confused them the way that one act of grace did. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what part of the story hit you the hardest.